This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Alright, good night and welcome to the Coffee 250 feature wrap up at this period coming towards the end of the election season. This is African Drums. I'm your host for tonight, filling in for LC Harry and Mr. David Hinds. Actually, Mr. David Hinds is the guest on the show tonight. As you know, this is your program brought to you by the Coffee 250 Committee. African Drums brought to you weekly. The magazine, really, of the Coffee 250 Committee. Tonight, I'm your host, Norwell Hinds, and I'm joined on this set by Mr. David Hinds, as I said, sitting just next to me, and sitting next to him, Mr. Aubrey Norton. These are not strangers to this show. I think both of these gentlemen have been on this show several times, and of course, Professor Hinds, Dr. David Hinds, has hosted and sometimes hosts the show from time to time. So tonight we are wrapping up really with some reflection on this election period and the work of Coffee 250 Committee in relation to its activities, its program of activities in communities. I want to first say welcome to our panelists, our guests for tonight. I want to thank them for taking the time to come out, and first start by asking the question: what is your sense of the work that Coffee 250 Committee has been doing in the communities? Your voter education campaign, with the staff meetings, what has been the feedback and response from the communities?
Thanks, Norwell, for having me. Yes, I mean, Coffee 250 has been, over the last couple of months, been doing some work on the ground, what we call voter consciousness work. Because it went beyond education, but really trying to bring a certain kind of consciousness to voters about the importance of the election, the importance of the vote. And we've been going into several communities and doing a kind of intimate kind of work. We know that political parties do the big rallies, the big public meetings, but we felt that there was need to do a kind of face-to-face work, a kind of ABCD kind of work. And we've been doing that. We've covered West Demerara, we covered the Quarantine, we covered parts of the East Coast and parts of Georgetown. And we're quite satisfied with the kind of work that we did, because as we went into the communities, we found that there were several questions that voters still had in terms of the technicalities of voting. But also we found some people who were kind of wavering about whether they should vote or not. The kind of apathy, the kind of apathetic voter. And we were able to talk to such people and really explain to them the historical importance of the vote, that the vote was not something that somebody gave to you, but something which people had to fight for, and so it must be cherished. And we were able to do that kind of work. So hopefully we would have moved some people who were kind of blasé about this whole electoral process. And if we were able to do that, if we were able to help in terms of answering some technical questions, and here I want to, on behalf of Coffee 250, really salute Brother Vincent Alexander, who has really done sterling work in this area, in that we were able to answer some piercing questions and some very important questions people had in terms of procedure. We're very happy to have played a small role in energizing this campaign and hopefully helping to deliver this much needed victory for the Guyanese people.
Okay. Mr. Aubrey Norton, Professor David Hinds here just touched on something very critical. This sense that the vote is historically significant. And he's also referenced and referred to a sort of apathy in our communities. What can we do even now, and what have we been doing to sort of bring out the vote in that sense?
The first thing is to raise consciousness. You have to let people know that there was a time in Guyana when there wasn't what is called universal adult suffrage, that you, regardless of your age, you couldn't vote. And that with the emergence of the Political Affairs Committee in the late 40s, the attempts began to fight for universal adult suffrage. And as a consequence, their first election on the universal adult suffrage was called in 1953 while Burnham and Jagan were together. And they didn't get it by just saying they wanted it and they got it. It was part of the anti-colonial struggle. And people actually struggled and lost life over this right to vote. From that standpoint, one has to see being permitted to vote as a right which has been struggled for, and therefore it has historical significance. In the present context, voting has significant significance. The significance lies in the fact that you're looking at a country in which in 50 years we've changed government only once. That doesn't say well for a democratic society. Democratic societies, people look at the issues and seek to vote based on the issues. And in that context, governments will change regularly. Barbados is a maximum of 10 years. Jamaica, virtually the same thing. Guyana, it isn't. So it is historic in the sense that you are seeking to break a trend and to shift Guyanese away from voting based on ethnicity to voting based on the issues. In this regard, one of the themes throughout the election was people saying, look, vote for the opposition. And in a democratic society, if you weren't satisfied with the opposition delivered, then you can vote them out. That again, I think, is significant. So one has the confluence of a number of significant things that will make this election critical. But its real significance will lie in people's response to these positions and come May the 12th, the results, which I think will favor the opposition.
So considering, and I'll leave this to you, Dr. Hinds, considering the sort of pattern of apathy, considering the issues that people have had to confront in their communities, in their lives, that tells them that, hey, I don't think things are going to ever change. So I understand the significance of voting, I understand the historical nature of the vote, but why is this election different? Why is it different?
It's different because not since 1953 that Aubrey mentioned, well, first election under self-rule. Not since 1953 have we been able to put before the Guyanese people a clear alternative to the norm. And why do I say this? In the APNU-AFC coalition, what we're putting before the people are 6 parties under one umbrella. Now, here is the importance of that. The importance of that is that you may not like the PNC, but you could vote for the AFC, or you could vote for the WPA, or you could vote for Justice for All. You may not like 2 parties in the alliance, but you may like 4, right? And you get a chance to vote for those 4. Now, that's extremely important here, because part of the apathy had to do with the fact that people did not see any kind of difference between the 2 major parties in the past, in that both of them may have appealed to ethnicity in the worst sense of ethnicity. And so what this election really presents is this really clear alternative to what we've had before. You're really voting for a broad umbrella of organizations, a broad umbrella of parties, and a broad umbrella of ideas. Because each party brings to the table different ideas, and we pull in all of those ideas together and putting them to the people. Now, in a society like ours that has been based on polarization, what people are generally looking for is how do we overcome polarization? And that's a very difficult thing. Aubrey will tell you in our study of ethnic societies, it's very difficult to overcome polarization. Now, one of the few ways in which you overcome polarization is you you really put together an anti-polarization coalition. And that's what I would like to describe this AFC-APNU as an anti-coalition, anti-polarization coalition. So when the voter goes out there and votes for the coalition, what that voter is doing is voting for something that is positive, something that is uplifting, and something that has been different from what we have tried in the past. We also have this golden opportunity now to really break out of a kind of debilitating, authoritarian, domineering type of politics that this PPP government is taking to a really new level. All right, that governance in Guyana has now become a kind of criminalization. Professor Clive Thomas talks about the criminalization of the state, in which governance seem to be grounded in the notion of criminality. Not when former President Jack Dio talks about kick your ass. It's not; those are not just words. What he's expressing there is a culture of governance. All right, and so therefore, what we have this opportunity to do is to break out of that culture of governance. Because what 6 parties in a coalition does is that it allows each of the party to police the other. I can tell you from the standpoint of the party that I belong to, the Working People's Alliance, that we see ourselves as not just part of governance, but we see ourselves as part of the oversight on behalf of the people. So you're in government, but you're oversighting government. And I think it opens up democracy in the country. And lastly, but and more importantly, one of the crying shame of this country and one of the cries of ordinary people is for respect. Now we take for granted the notion of respect. Coming out of the slave plantations, coming out of the indentured fields and so on, what emancipation and freedom from indentureship has always meant is respect. You're the Jamaican stock, but self-respect, man. You go across the Caribbean, you hear your old people say, respect, respect, not respect. What Guyanese people want above and everything else is a kind of respect. Respect by those who are in authority, but also to help us to develop a sense of self-respect, which is gone. And self-respect has to be grounded in the notion of resistance. Resistance doesn't necessarily mean that you fight down and break up. Resistance means that you're constantly pushing the boundaries. TLR James say, going beyond the boundaries. Jimmy Cliff says, many rivers to cross. Constantly pushing those boundaries, opening up the space for freedom. What Bob Marley said, why can't we not roam this open country? That's what people are asking for. To give us freedom, to give us that space so that we can pull ourselves out of poverty. That government is not going to come and give you a freck, give you a small piece. What government does is facilitate us, empowering ourselves so that we can feed, we can clothe, and we can educate our children so that they can move beyond where we have been.
I think that one has to recognize that this election, the platform that is being offered by the APNU-AFC is clearly an exercise in power sharing. Here you have a situation where if the AFC is talking to the APNU and they're becoming excessive, they have the right to vote against the APNU in Parliament. That would mean the AFC becomes a check on the APNU. If the APNU is speaking to the AFC and they are strong-headed and don't want to, they have a veto as well. So the first point I want to make about this arrangement is that it shares power. The second point I want to make about it, it allows for ethnic representation. They're saying you must vote on issues, but we do accept that one of the problems Guyana has is that when the PPP is in power, African Guyanese tend to feel left out. When the PNC was in power, Indian Guyanese tend to feel left out. You now have a situation where you can create a government in which Indians and Africans see representation and real power wielding. I believe that is absolutely significant in this election. The next point I want to make is that this election is critical because the government itself created the conditions for people to look at issues. This government has marginalized even its support base. Years ago, it would have been difficult to go in and Indian community. I've been in on the West MRR campaigning. Farms will say to you, we plead with them, but they took our area for grazing cattle and put what you call it, athletics track, and there's no athletics there. They will tell you that behind the Willem and some other areas, the PPP leadership give land to their cronies, and they cannot access lands for cattle to deal with the cattle. So what in essence has happened is that they are now recognizing that the PPP, while claiming to represent them, are really marginalizing them. So the first thing I would say is the PPP by its approach that has caused that. Then you also have a situation where the leadership of the PPP has become so disrespectful and abusive that the average man in a community, you going into those communities on the West Coast, and they could always point you to some ordinary man, but the PPP powerful people do something, I did a slap them up. So this election is also a battle against the abuse of power, the abuse of authority. I think those factors, among others, are rallying people. Additionally, it is clear that the PPP is out of ideas, and the list of corrupt activities they have, it is so long a list. I mean, when people talk about Amelia Falls and Flip Motilal flipping off with our money, it is evident to anybody that Jagdeo and Ramata could say what they want. If you take the property they have and put it against their salary, they can't get a mortgage. So the evidence of corruption is clear. And I believe all of those factors have contributed to all the Guyanese, or majority of the Guyanese, wanting a change. The inverse of that is this: the people who are corrupt now become vicious, because a change is dangerous for them, because they have violated the law in all fashion. And most recently, Belize, the CCJ ruled in a case in Belize that if government officials do things like selling property below the value of it and distributing property to itself, then they could be criminally prosecuted. That must have sent shivers through them. And so I believe that we are at a point where people need change. People are acting for change, and the government is panicking and reacting with desperation. But you know, I think there's a saying which says, those who the Lord wish to destroy first make mad, that we're seeing the madness unfolding.
You know, this is interesting because indeed I think when you look at Facebook and you look in the media and you look at the response to these rallies, is tremendous. I think that there is a consensus, as you're rightly saying, that here, you know what, I have been so abused in this society that I have to take action. You know, I sense though that there is still fear. There is this notion of ethnic security, and the sense that we know what we have, but we don't know what we might have. And how then do we speak to people who don't feel that from an ethnic standpoint they're secure? What do we need to do? What have we done? Because we've been doing a lot.
I don't believe that is true now. I don't believe ethnic security is the problem. I believe the problem now is instilled fear. They are calling people, threatening them. Their activists are doing all kinds of things to people.
And they're talking about 1964 with this, with the
so it is
the
instilled fear.
together.
Instilled fear. I believe the coalition, the Commonsburg Accord, has served to diminish the feeling of insecurity. The fact that power is distributed and Moses becomes the chairman of cabinet, and there are agreements that agriculture will go to the AFC and most likely Moses. All of that would have given the Indian community confidence that their leaders have a say in it. But that portends danger for the PPP. And so they went about scaremongering, etc. So I believe our task is to say to people in the Indian community, you have a deal that will ensure that you are represented. You are being threatened. You need to be calm. You need to come out and vote. They can threaten how much they want. They cannot know how you vote. And once they are voted out, after Monday, they are no more. So what power are they going to use to do you anything? That is a decision that has to be made now. That there's a share in the national pie for everybody, that the PPP is instilling fear, but that you can go and vote for who you want, they wouldn't know. Much as if it's large numbers in the Indian community, which one they can choose? So I think we have to deal with the fear that they instill, and to say to people, you can vote and have no fear. They cannot know who you vote for. That fear element is what I think is the real fear. The other fear you have is the likes of Jack Doe fear in prosecution. We can't do much about that. Anybody who violates the law should feel the full force of the law. I think the AP and UFC has made it clear that they will allow due process and that the chips fall where they may, but anybody who violates the law should be dealt with by the law.
Yeah, Norwell, look, our Indian sisters and brothers have to be given the assurance that victory by the APNU-AFC coalition would secure their own interests and would take into consideration their own insecurities. And I think we've gone a long way towards demonstrating that. That when the PPP talks about this fear of the PNC, that's really fiction. Because the PNC they're talking about has long gone into history. The PNC that you have now is a different PNC. I said on an earlier program this afternoon that when you look at the PNC, you've seen a party that has moved in the direction of a positive nationalist outlook. In 2006, the PNC won Guyana, 2011, the APNU, 2015, APNU-AFC. You can't say that that's a party that is stuck in the past, right? That's a party that is moving as the country is moving, that is tapping in to the instincts and the frustrations of the society. The PPP up to today is saying that they are not in favor of power sharing. They're not in favor of a national solution. And so, yes, parties move, they don't stand still. Here we have one party moving in a positive direction and another party moving in a negative and a very backward direction. And so therefore that thing that was scaring the Indian community about the PNC is a really deeper thing, that it's about saying that African Guyanese are not able to govern, right? That they're not capable of governing. And so therefore it is that we have to address. We have to come to grips with the fact that we all were brought here under different circumstances, but we are here. And we all have had negative experiences in this country. By we all, I mean the different ethnic groups. But here we are today in 2015, and this country belongs to all of us. That African people are no worse than any other ethnic or racial group on the face of the earth. They are bad people in all ethnic groups. But really to characterize black people as essentially and biologically bad people, or Amerindian people or Indian people, it's really backwardness. It's unproven by common sense, by biology, and all of those things.
Could I intervene here? It is selective saying that black people are bad.
Yeah.
You could take Luncheon. You could take Lumumba. You could take the one that is over the edge, Edge Hill. And these black people are good because they are associated with the PPP. And the others aren't. Even though some of them, the evidence suggests they are very corrupt. And they can't point to no corruption for David Granger. There are many people in the PNC, PNU. And one of the points I make about these elections, one of the advantages you have is that Granger wielded power as a soldier, and the PPP can find nothing to say about him but corruption. Moses Nagamootoo came from inside the PPP. If they had anything to expose, they would expose it long. it is safe to say, therefore, he
All
has
he can
integrity.
say is in the Quran.
Yes.
Mhm.
And so the point I'm making is that they are not interested in the qualities of person. They are interested in Africans who they can control. They don't mind if they're corrupt. They don't mind if they're thief. What they're interested in is that they must fall under the political domination. And I need to make that point, because it's like this dealing with the army. The army is bad for governance, except when Jack Dale took Joe Singh and make him what I made him. Except when Jack Dale made Atlee what I made him. Except when Jack Dale made Ram Sarup, who is now head of civil defense, and make him. And we can run the list of soldiers that Jack Dale took and put into position. But the minute the soldier is a challenge to your corruption and your lawlessness, suddenly soldiers become people who, if you give power, they can be very destructive. Let me say this in closing this point. There is no political figure in this country that could challenge Jack Dale for corruption and lawlessness. And he can say whatever he wants. The truth of the matter is he's unchallenged. He's unparalleled. And anything after he can be worse.
You know, last night at the rally, what we witnessed was something very interesting. We saw Ulele Burnham and we saw Chedi Jagan Jr. on the same platform. Of course, that must be significant. What do you feel is the message that persons out there got from that presentation?
Well, the message that we ought to take away from that presentation is that the world doesn't stand still, right? That we move on. Look, we've got to come to grips that Burnham is not an alien. He's a Guyanese. He's a product of our society. However flawed you may think he was, he is a Guyanese. Jagan is not an alien, he's a Guyanese. However flawed we may think he was, he is a Guyanese. We've got to come to grips in this country that we've got to find space in our conversation. We've got to find space in our culture to include Burnham, to include Jagan, to include Rodney, to include Kwayana, to include Digar, to include all of those who at some point may have opposed each other. So I think the lesson when we see those two people, Joy Jagan and Ulele Burnham, holding hands, is to say that countries have to work through their difficulties. And their being on that platform last night has shown the extent to which this coalition has helped us to work through our difficulties. We are not the only country to have had difficulties among leaders. In Trinidad, in Barbados, in Jamaica, we have had leaders, some of them were cousins. Bustamante and Norman Manley were cousins in Jamaica, and so forth. And societies have to work those things through. And so that example last night was a very powerful signal of the possibilities of Guyana. We have it. I mean, look at the APNU. All right, the birth of the APNU was the WPA and the PNC. They didn't like each other. They might have called each other enemies 30 years ago, but here they are sitting together in a coalition. It can't be opportunism, as some people have us believe. It has to be that here are two organizations who at some point were locked in battle against each other, understanding that as the world moves on, the society moves on, that they themselves have to come to grips with those changes. So this coalition really represents the working out of a lot of the tensions that we have had in our society and giving our people hope. That's what part of what people ask for. Give us hope that some or the other we can overcome our difficulties. When you looked at that platform and you saw Moses Nagamotu and you saw Rupert Rupnarayan, you saw Ulele, you saw Joy Jagan, you're talking about all the different stripes in the tapestry of our politics coming together in one place. And let me say this last thing before I turn it back to you. For the first time, we have a coalition. It's a coalition, but Moses Nagamotu is not a token Indian. He's not the Indian face, right, is an integral part of this coalition, right? So, yes, I mean, the coalition, most of its voters will come from the African Guyanese community, but in terms of its own outlook, in terms of its own philosophy, in terms of what it represents the inclusiveness of what Guyana should really be. And I think that's the major attraction. And to Indian brothers and sisters, you don't want not to be part of that. You don't want to be on the wrong side of history. You have never been on the wrong side of history. And here's an opportunity to really be on the correct side of history, because we're moving. We're not looking back. We're, insofar as we have a past, is to learn the lessons of that past and really to construct the future. So when you see Yoleli and Joy there, it's about learning from that past and constructing something positive out of that past for our future. A powerful symbol.
I think there's another element of it we must look at. Joey made it clear that he disagreed with his father's communist views. Melanie Yuleli from her presentation seemed to feel that elements of what Burnham did was part of an authoritarian culture that needs to go. It says two things. First of all, children can differ from their parents. Two, children can learn from their parents' era. But the greatest message it sent is that there can be a new era, and that your history can impact your new era in a positive way. And I believe that the history has impacted it in a positive way. So that Yuleli and another significance, you know, since probably the 1950s, you did not have in this country political parties emerging with two leaders, one African, one Indian, in which there is a respect for them by the constituencies since Burnham and Jagan. And I believe that is significant, because Kemraj ran in 2006, but it was evident that when Moses came in 2006, in 2011, there was a respect for him as a leader in the community. Granger emerged as a leader in the community. So what in fact you have are two leaders that are reflective of two significant ethnic groups, and that in itself removes the idea of anybody being token. I mean, if you compare that with Sam Hinds, there's little or no respect for him on any ethnic group.
Because he's a token.
Because he's a token.
Yeah.
No, I don't believe it is tokenism. It's a clear case of sharing power and with leaders that have the respect of their communities. And that, I think, will make a significant difference going forward. Now, I don't believe that we will have solved all the problems, but I think we have placed our foot on the threshold where we can deal with the ethnic problems. And once the coalition learns to be tolerant of each other and work together and work through the problems, I believe it's the beginning of removing the ethnic securities and ensuring that ethnic groups feel that they are part of the political and economic system and are sharing in it. One of the things that cause a lot of the revulsion you're getting is the way the People's Progressive Party has marginalized people. And I think they underestimated what they did to the Amerindian community when they choose to slap a young Amerindian who asked them a question. It was like a challenge to an entire ethnic group, saying, you have no right to ask me a question, and since you asked me a question, I clap a slap in you. No, I think that will also contribute to them losing, because they remember first they were told that if Jack knew being he would slap you, and then after that you get an actual slap. I think that has sent the signal to people that this is disrespect for a particular
and then of course more recently the threat to strip and slap of the young lady Lena Free.
Just because I can do it.
Just because. There's this notion of power.
Yeah.
And just as we're coming towards the end of the program, some interesting things came up there as you both were sharing. And I wanted us to zoom in a little bit on some of the key issues that have been emerging within the discourse in this political season. some of the key socio-economic and political issues that the new government will have to confront. I think rice and the treatment of farmers is one issue. I think, for example, we see the treatment of teachers and workers, the treatment of armed services. You know, so these are some key emerging issues. And I want to know if you can share with us, from your work in the communities, what do you see as some of the challenges that this new government will have to confront and address and solve, really?
I would say the biggest challenge the government has, it started to deal with, was to start to work to have a governance system that people can accept and feel they are part and parcel of the government. I think the first thing that happened with the coalition is that. The second issue, I think, is even before you meet the economy, etc., the society has become a lawless society. And I believe one of the reasons why David and Moses resonate is because they are seen as law-abiding people who are not into the criminal culture that is engulfing the society. And I think the society is also contended that if you have leadership, you could deal with those issues. So governance, to me, is the major problem. We have had political leaders with skill, with all kinds of abilities, and they didn't succeed because, one, people feel divided, and two, the system of governance was never accepted. I believe the major challenge you face is to develop the political system, change the political culture, so people believe you are genuinely democratic, and that you're not using democracy as a means of getting power and then doing what you like. Once the APNU AFC can begin to show that they genuinely believe in democracy and that they will operate based on good governance, I believe the others will fall into place. Though I think there are issues, I believe the critical issue is the governance issue to deal with.
And I want to pick up on the governance issue because I think that's extremely important. One of the things that the PPP has succeeded in doing over the last 23 years is to strip this nation of its right and its ability to stand up and talk back, to resist. And what this campaign has shown is that we're beginning to stir again as a nation. People like to cuss and say about women doing this and trampling on flags and what they did in Buxton. I am not swayed by those arguments. I believe that when you trample people as they have trampled people in this country, once you give people an opening, they begin to express themselves in ways that they know how to express. I am not going to sit here and condemn any woman who decides to express herself in a certain kind of way at what she has had to deal with for 23 years. Often we wait until the situation get bad and poor people react and then condemn poor people. You know, they do it in Baltimore. You know, nobody care about poor people, but when poor people get vexed and they start to behave and express their frustration, we condemn them. I am not about to do that. I stand by my brothers and sisters in Buxton who express their democratic right to decide who can come in their village to speak uninterrupted. If a government that has not been kind to a people and they have not been kind to that community, they have described that community as hooligans and as thieves, and those people have a right to say, you come here, we have a right to raise our voices above your voices, and I will not condemn that. In fact, I salute Buxtonians for expressing that, because that is what has been killed for the last 23 years. So I believe that this new government will have to deal with the whole notion of dissent. That is, people have a right to express their opinion against a government, including a government that they like. You can rest assured that David Hinds, although I support wholeheartedly this coalition, if this coalition steps out of hand, they will hear my voice, because I think it's a democratic right. I will protest against you because I love you. You see? And one of the things that the PPP did was to really kick that that notion of descent through the door. So I think one of the big challenges of this new government is to restore the right to dissent and to respect poor people. The disrespect for poor people in this country is palpable. I am so revolted by it. You know, we look, as soon as we see poor people behave a certain way, we condemn them. Oh, they're hooligans. We will not stand for this. And no one goes into those communities and see how those people live from day to day. Now, poverty is the biggest issue, not only in Guyana, but in all third world countries, so-called third world countries, and in poor communities across the world. What we see in Baltimore or Ferguson, and we see here in Guyana, is as a result of what? Unparalleled poverty in societies. The basic issue I think that this new government has to face is what to do about poverty. Not in the medium term, not in the long term, but in the short term. It's an absolute insult to the dignity of human beings to have a school teacher earning $50,000 a month. That is an insult to the dignity of poor people, to the dignity of working people. And so this government will have to deal with the question of empowering our people, beginning to empower our people economically. Now, we have so many young people, Indians and Africans and Amerindians, who have done the right thing. They've gone to school, qualified themselves, but not able to make a decent living and to work for a living wage. So we've got to deal with that. We've got to respect poor people, and we've got to deal with the question of poverty. So poor people will have an equal chance like all of us. Aubrey, you, me, we're all children of the poor. We've gotten where we are because of education. And here we are standing up and defending that community. But that community needs more than defense. It needs facilitating their jobs, facilitating opportunities for small businesses, and we need a government that is going to do that not as an act of clientelism, but as an act of policy, a consistent policy to lift our people from the dire poverty that not they found themselves in, but that governments have put them in.
I was in Wakenham and Legwan, and when you saw the level of illiteracy, it transcended race.
Yes.
So the government, by its actions, they are producing a number of illiterates. And any society that is producing illiterates head into trouble. I want to make this point. I don't want much when they talk about hooliganism, because in my opinion, Jack Doe is a political hooligan. The only difference between Jack Doe and people who protest is that he had access to state power, and he could have used that state power so that his political hooliganism is not dealt with. All the people have to deal with that political hooliganism is the protest, etc. And I have no problem with protests. It is well known that I believe people entitled to protest. As a little boy growing up, if I disagree, my father used to say it. Even if you get too lash. And no politician, especially as pompous as Jack Doe, will close me down from saying that. I want to make this last point. It is the same PPP that when Buxtonians came out and stopped Dr. Jagan casket when it was going up, went all over the media and praising Buxtonians as very nice people who respect Dr. Jagan. The things that Dr. Jagan believed in died with him. And the beast that replaced him has marginalized and destroyed Buxton, Linden, etc., whether we like it or not. But because we talk and the name is African Guyanese, but if you go to Divilem village, they have destroyed young Indian people. If you go to virtually any Indian village, we make the mistake of making this elite that is making money and have a nice time in the Indian community. It isn't. They have marginalized and destroyed the average young Indian. You've seen them as junkie, you've seen them as illiterate. And so we have got to put it in context and recognize that the unfortunate thing is that a lot of people in the government, in the Indian community, you have got to explain it so that they understand in large measure what they're doing is virtually against a class which might happen to be of different race.
No, well, before we go, it has just been brought to my attention as we are doing the show that workers of churches chicken place may not be getting time off to go and vote tomorrow. And we've been hearing this from a number of business places. And we want to sound the warning that it is the democratic right of people to exercise their right to vote, and they have to have time off from their job. So we want, if this is true, we want to say to churches in this open space that you are not going to be allowed to do that, whoever you are in this country. Let those workers go to vote tomorrow, and let all workers of this country, essential workers, go out to vote, because it's democratic right. Now, we have suffered too long in this country. We have suffered through slavery, through indentureship, through colonialism, through all kinds of depravity, and we have stood tall in terms of we are here today. But we are here today to say that we are at this crucial juncture in our history, and at this crucial juncture we've got to be part of the change. It means that stop whatever you're doing. Those of you all who still taking this thing for skin teeth and believing that the election tomorrow it ain't gonna change nothing, I want to appeal to you and say it will change something. Once the coalition wins, it will change the direction of this country. And if you change the direction of this country, it opens up possibilities to do a lot of things that could affect your lives. So if you're out there taking a drink, take an early drink tonight and go home so that you can be sober in the morning. If you're taking a smoke, take an early smoke and then go home and come out tomorrow sober so that you can be part of change. We cannot take this for granted. To our Indian brothers and sisters, whether you like it or not, we are all in this together. This is not about African people. This is not about Amerindian people. This is not about Indian people alone. This is about all of us standing together and demanding that we are people, we are dignified people. Our dignity is taking a hit. Indian dignity, African dignity, Amerindian dignity. But we are prepared to stand tomorrow arm in arm and shoulder to shoulder, and to use that piece of paper, use that ballot as a signal to the world that we are ready to arrest our own humanity and to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in the rest of the world and say we're human beings. So go to the polls tomorrow, exercise your right to vote. If they don't want to give you, walk off the job and go and vote. We'll deal with that later. So if church is listening, let those workers go and vote.
Thank you very much, David. As we come to the end of this program, Coffee 250 Committee, the message of Coffee 250 Committee and the work of Coffee 250 Committee in the communities has been about self-reliance. There is no greater act of self-reliance than to exercise that democratic right we've been talking about today, which is that act of voting. In this particular election, it is critical that we recognize that we have to stand together, as the panelists have said, and more so that we have to help each other. Ensure that you find out if your neighbor voting. Ensure that you go online to www.gcom.org.gy to find out where your polling station is. If you don't know where it is, call any of the numbers. And I think the next, at the end of the program, we're probably going to put up some numbers for the coalition headquarters if you need any support and if you need any information in relation to where you need to get to polling stations and so on. Of course, if you got a car, if you're boiling a pot tomorrow, make sure you take the pot and carry it and help the scrutineers, the polling agents and so on. Make sure you get something to eat. Use your car to transport people. This is a time of change, and this is an act of self-reliance, and that is the message of the Coffee 250 Committee. This has been African Drums, a presentation of the Coffee 250 Committee. Tonight we were looking at elections perspectives. Good luck tomorrow. Vote for change, and we can see you next week Sunday when we celebrate. Good night.
Monday, 11th of May.